Imagine, if you will, taking one of those incredibly in-depth psychological personality tests.
Oh, yeah.
You know the exact kind I mean. Like, you sit down, you answer 100 highly specific questions about, how you react to stress or how you handle a weekend with no plans.
Right. Whether you prefer your living room or getting lost in a foreign city.
Exactly, exactly. And at the end, the algorithm spits out this profile. And let's say this specific profile says that you are, at your absolute core, adventurous, you're spontaneous, you are, like, wildly curious.
Okay, I'm tracking.
You're someone who thrives on making new connections, breaking routines, pushing past boundaries. It's basically the profile of the friend you'd absolutely call if you were planning, like, a cross-country road trip with zero itinerary.
Right, which, from a psychological standpoint, I mean, that profile describes a highly open, dynamic individual. Just someone who really embraces risk and novelty.
Yeah, for sure. But now I want you to imagine taking that exact same personality test with all of those restless, boundary-pushing, thrill-seeking traits and handing it not to a person, but to an entire country.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right, and not just any country. We are talking about a nation sitting on the very edge of the known world at the time, a nation that's about to be handed, like, unprecedented maritime technology and essentially unlimited global power.
See, when you scale those human traits up to the level of a geopolitical entity, the entire paradigm just completely shifts.
Yeah.
Because if you take that spontaneous, adventurous energy and you remove the natural constraints of, well, interpersonal empathy, because obviously a state apparatus doesn't feel empathy the way a person does, the picture becomes incredibly complex.
It really does.
I mean, the drive for experience suddenly becomes a drive for expansion.
And that is exactly why we are diving straight into something truly unique today. We're looking at a set of highly detailed research notes based around a document titled Portuguese Empire.pdf. And what makes this so fascinating to me is that it doesn't just give us, like, a dry, date-heavy history lesson.
Right. No one wants just a list of dates.
Exactly. It actually maps the entire history of the Portuguese Empire onto a psychological sub-personality profile, this persona that the author literally names Addy.
It's such a clever framing. Because
Huh.
our mission today for this deep dive is to trace how a relatively small European kingdom managed to build this sprawling, unprecedented network empire.
Yeah.
We're going to examine the actual mechanics of how they did it, the massive human costs, and the cultural collisions that followed. And ultimately, we're going to use this Addy persona to understand the core thesis of these notes, which is basically what actually happens when human curiosity is scaled up into unchecked global imperial power.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And I think we need to start with the literal ground they stood on. Because if we're looking at Portugal as this restless, Addy personality, we have to look at the physical environment that, created that restlessness to begin with. The source material argues that for Portugal, geography was absolute destiny.
Oh, 100%. To understand why, you have to picture a map of the Iberian Peninsula back in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Right.
Portugal is just this narrow strip of land pinned to the extreme western edge of Europe. To their east and their north, you have the powerful consolidating kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which, would eventually become Spain.
And those kingdoms were huge.
Massive. They had deep reserves of agricultural land, timber, men, everything. Portugal, by comparison, was relatively resource poor. They just didn't have the demographic weight or the vast, fertile inland plains to build, like a traditional continent-spanning land empire.
So if you're the king of Portugal, looking eastward means you're basically staring at a brick wall of superior military and political power.
Yeah.
You just can't expand that way. But when you turn around and look west, you are staring right at the Atlantic Ocean. And not just staring at it. I mean, you have this incredibly long, rugged coastline filled with natural deep water ports.
Right. It's this combination of being blocked by land and just entirely invited by the sea.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, the Atlantic wasn't just like a calm lake. It was an incredibly hostile frontier.
Oh, terrifying.
Yeah, but Portugal had a distinct geographical advantage regarding the wind. They were perfectly positioned to catch the prevailing trade winds. When you leave the Portuguese coast, the winds and currents naturally push you south and west. So the environment itself was this massive gravitational pull toward maritime exploration.
Which brings up a really fascinating structural shift in how empires actually operate, because the notes emphasize that due to this geography, Portugal built a network empire. And I was trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this while reading. Like, if traditional empires, the Romans or the Mongols were like buying up massive continuous blocks of real estate,
Yeah.
was Portugal's strategy more like, I don't know, just buying up all the toll booths and the highways?
The coal booth analogy is structurally very sound,
Yep.
but let's push the mechanics of it a bit further.
Okay.
A traditional land empire requires massive standing armies to pacify huge swaths of inland territory, right?
Yeah.
You have to garrison every town, police every road, extract taxes from every farmer.
Which takes a lot of people.
Exactly. Portugal simply did not have the population to do that globally. Even at their height, we are talking about a nation of roughly 1 million people trying to project power across multiple oceans.
Wow. Yeah, the math on that just doesn't work if you're trying to conquer continents.
So the strategy detailed in the source material outlines this two-stage survival mechanism. First, they had to conquer the Atlantic itself. They had to figure out how to survive the open ocean, which meant developing robust shipbuilding and deep-sea fishing industries.
Right.
But the second stage is where that network empire concept really comes in. Instead of painting the map a solid color, they relied on strategic choke points.
Yeah, and the notes use a highly evocative visual for this. The author describes the Portuguese Empire as a chain of campfires scattered across the globe.
I love that metaphor. It's so apt for a maritime network, because these campfires were fortified trading posts, ports, and island bases. And the sequence of them is just remarkable.
Right, they kind of hopped along.
Yeah, they pushed out to the Atlantic islands, first Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde. Then they just inched down the western coast of Africa, setting up these coastal forts called fattorias, or factories,
Right.
which, by the way, were essentially heavily armed warehouses.
Just bristling with cannons, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Then they went around the Cape of Good Hope, up the East African coast to places like Mozambique, across the Indian Ocean, to Goa in India, all the way to Malacca in modern-day Malaysia, and Macau in China, and, of course, across the Atlantic to Brazil.
Wait, I'm stuck on this, though. You call them campfires, and that sounds very, contained and small. But how does a tiny country with a population of barely 1 million people actually enforce this network thousands of miles away from home?
That's the big question.
Right, like, if I'm a local ruler in India and a few Portuguese ships roll up demanding to control my port, why don't I just overwhelm them with sheer numbers on land?
Because the Portuguese deliberately avoided fighting on the local ruler's terms whenever possible. They did not want to march inland. Their strength was entirely concentrated on the water and the immediate coastline.
Ah, okay.
So if a local ruler tried to overwhelm them on land, the Portuguese would just retreat to their fortified coastal castles or their ships. From the water, they possessed a technological asymmetry that local powers just couldn't immediately counter. They could blockade the port, bombard the city with naval artillery, and completely choke off the ruler's maritime trade revenue until they capitulated.
Okay, so the campfire isn't just a cozy trading post. It is a heavily armed garrison guarding a toll booth.
Precisely.
But that brings us to a massive logistical hurdle. You cannot build a global network of toll booths spanning from the Atlantic to the South China Sea if your ships keep sinking or getting lost. You need a massive leap in technology to pull this off.
Which is exactly where we arrive at the hardware and software of this expansion. The 15th and 16th centuries saw a convergence of technologies that the source text identifies as the critical enabler of this addy energy. I mean, you couldn't be bold and mobile without the right gear.
Yeah, let's talk about that gear, because the notes break it down into specific components: navigation, cartography, ship design, and maritime artillery. I really want to understand the actual mechanics of this. So, for instance, ship design. What were they sailing that was so revolutionary?
Well, the quintessential vessel of early Portuguese exploration was the caravel.
The caravel.
Right. Before the caravel, European ships were largely designed for the relatively calm, predictable waters of the Mediterranean, or just for short coastal hops along the Atlantic. They used square-rigged sails.
Okay.
Now, square sails are great if the wind is blowing exactly behind you, pushing you forward. But if the wind is blowing against you, a square sail is useless. You're just stuck.
And if you're trying to explore, like, the uncharted coast of Africa, where the winds are totally unpredictable, getting stuck basically means you die.
Exactly. So the caravel incorporated lateen sails, which are triangular. This design allows a ship to actually sail into the wind at an angle, a technique known as tacking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Suddenly, a ship wasn't entirely at the mercy of the prevailing winds. It was highly maneuverable. It was relatively shallow drafted, so it could explore coastal river mouths, but it was sturdy enough to survive Atlantic storms.
That's the hardware. But what about the software, the navigation? Because, I mean, sailing into the wind is great, but you still need to know where you actually are.
And that required a complete paradigm shift. For centuries, sailors relied on dead reckoning and coastal navigation, basically keeping the land in sight at all times. But once Portugal pushed into the deep Atlantic, there were no landmarks. They had to transition to astronomical navigation.
Stargazing.
Yeah, they learned to use instruments like the astrolabe and the quadrant.
Wait, how does an astrolabe actually work in this context? Because I've seen them in museums, and they just look like these really beautiful, complicated brass discs.
They are beautiful. At its core, a mariner's astrolabe is a tool for measuring the angle of celestial bodies, like the sun at noon or the North Star at night relative to the horizon.
Okay.
So by calculating that angle and then referencing complex mathematical tables, a navigator could determine their ship's latitude, which is their position north or south of the equator.
So they are literally turning the night sky into a coordinate system.
Yes, exactly. And they combined this with portolan charts, which were maps crisscrossed with a web of lines radiating from compass roses. And that allowed pilots to plot a course based on compass headings and estimated distances.
But the text makes a very pointed argument here, which I think challenges the traditional Eurocentric lone genius narrative we're so used to. The author highlights that Portugal didn't just, invent all of this out of thin air in some darkened room in Lisbon.
Not at all. The source material is adamant that this era of innovation was largely an era of integration.
Right.
The math required for those astronomical tables. Much of it was preserved, refined, and expanded by Arab and Jewish astronomers. The astrolabe itself was an ancient instrument, heavily developed in the Islamic world. The lateen sail had been used by Arab dhows in the Indian Ocean for centuries.
So they were basically the ultimate system integrators.
Yes.
They looked at the tools already present in the Mediterranean and North African trading spheres, absorbed them, modified them for the brutal conditions of the Atlantic, and then they weaponized them.
Weaponize is the exact right word. The Portuguese innovation wasn't necessarily inventing the astrolabe, it was institutionalizing its use on ships packed with heavy bronze cannons.
Right.
They created a repeatable, systemic military commercial complex. And nowhere is that systemic weaponization more evident than in the Cartaz system.
Oh man, let's talk about the Cartaz. Because this is where the sheer audacity of this empire becomes staggering. According to the notes, when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, they were entering a trading zone that had existed peacefully, or at least functionally, for centuries.
Yes.
You had Arab, Indian, Chinese, and East African merchants trading spices, silk, and cotton in this really relatively open, complex network.
And the Portuguese arrived and essentially attempted to impose a monopoly on an ocean they didn't even own.
How did it physically work? Like day to day?
Well, the Cartaz was a physical document. It was a naval pass issued by the Portuguese authorities. The strategy was just brutally straightforward. The Portuguese declared that any merchant ship sailing in the Indian Ocean, whether they were carrying pepper from Malabar or silk from Gujarat, had to purchase this Cartaz.
Wow.
Furthermore, the pass often dictated that the merchant ship had to pay taxes at a Portuguese-controlled port.
Wait, let me put myself in the shoes of an Indian merchant in, the year 1515. I've been sailing these routes my whole life. My grandfather sailed these routes. And suddenly, a Portuguese ship appears on the horizon and demands I show them a piece of paper that I had to buy from them just to sail on my own ocean.
Yeah.
What happens if I refuse?
If you refused, or if you were caught without a Cartaz, the Portuguese naval patrols had standing orders to attack. They would confiscate your cargo, sink your ship, and frequently murder or enslave the crew. The source text distills the entire policy into a 5-word summary: pay us, or we sink you.
That is literal piracy, but elevated to state policy. It's a protection racket on a planetary scale.
It really was. It was the institutionalization of naval violence to control supply chains. And to understand how this was physically implemented, the text points us toward the historical figures who engineered it. Specifically, a man named Afonso de Albuquerque.
Ah, Albuquerque. The notes describe him as the chief architect of this hard power approach in the Indian Ocean. He's the one who looked at this vast ocean and figured out how to choke it.
Exactly. Albuquerque understood maritime grand strategy with a terrifying clarity. He realized that to control the Indian Ocean, you didn't need to conquer India or Arabia. You just needed to hold the doors.
Right.
So he identified 3 primary choke points. First, Goa, on the western coast of India, which became their heavily fortified headquarters. Second, Hormuz, an island at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, controlling the flow of goods toward the Middle East and Europe. And third, Malacca.
Let's look at Malacca because the geography there is so vital. It's a narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra.
Right, and if you wanted to sail from India to China, or vice versa, the monsoon winds essentially forced you to funnel through the Strait of Malacca. It was a great warehouse to the east. Albuquerque brought a fleet there in 1511. He demanded control, was refused, and proceeded to bombard and conquer the city with an overwhelming display of artillery and close-quarters combat.
And the document is totally uncompromising in its description of his methods. I mean, he was undeniably a strategic genius, but his tactics relied on massacres, the severing of limbs of captives to instill terror, and absolute rigid control over the conquered populations.
Yes.
He is kind of the ultimate manifestation of the dark side of that Addy personality, right? Taking the bold energy of expansion and completely divorcing it from human empathy.
It really forces us to confront the reality of how global trade systems were actually built. They weren't built purely on the superiority of European goods. I mean, often the Portuguese had nothing of value to trade. They were built on the superiority of European naval artillery.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the text doesn't just stop at the systemic level. It asks us to examine the specific men, these architects of this age of discovery, and look at them through this lens of duality. The notes suggest these men are neither the spotless heroes of old nationalist textbooks nor simple, one-dimensional villains.
Right, they are incredibly complex, often contradictory figures operating within a completely brutal paradigm. And the author begins this character study with Prince Henry the Navigator.
Who, ironically, almost never navigated.
True. He was a prince of the royal house who lived in the early 15th century. Now, in traditional historiography, he's the visionary. He established a base at Sagres. He gathered map makers, astronomers, shipwrights.
Yeah.
And he persistently funded these early, terrifying voyages down the uncharted coasts of West Africa. He is basically the man who lit the first campfire.
But the modern analysis in the text really pulls back the curtain on why he was funding these voyages. It wasn't just pure scientific curiosity. He was looking for gold. He was looking for a mythical Christian king named Prester John to ally with against Islamic powers. And crucially, he was deeply involved in the origins of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes, the text highlights that under Henry's sponsorship, the Portuguese began attacking coastal African communities. They captured men, women, and children and brought them back to Portugal to be sold. And Henry the Navigator took his cut of this human trafficking. The notes frame him perfectly within the Addy persona. He desired connection and exploration, but he was fundamentally an enabler of massive exploitation. He opened the routes, but those routes immediately became arteries of trauma.
Which leads us directly to Vasco da Gama, the man who finally achieved the dream of sailing from Europe around Africa all the way to India in 1497. And the sheer navigational achievement is staggering.
Oh, it's unparalleled for the time.
He sailed for 90 days out of sight of land in the deep Atlantic just to catch the right winds to round the Cape. By comparison, Columbus was only out of sight of land for about 33 days.
Yeah, and da Gama's voyage fundamentally broke the old geopolitical world order. By finding a direct sea route to India, he bypassed the Venetian and Ottoman monopolies on the spice trade. He shifted the center of global wealth from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic.
But again, the notes force us to look at the dual reality. The navigational bravery is undeniable, but his actions upon arriving in the Indian Ocean were just horrific.
Absolutely brutal.
During his voyages, he bombarded the city of Calicut. He intercepted a ship returning from Mecca, filled with Muslim pilgrims, looted it, locked the passengers in the hold, and set the ship on fire, burning hundreds of men, women, and children alive.
The text insists we hold both of these realities in our minds simultaneously. The man who expanded the map of the known world for Europe was the exact same man who introduced a terrifying new scale of state-sponsored terrorism to the Indian Ocean. He was the vanguard of a system that equated commercial dominance with martial brutality.
And this brings us to Pedro Alvarez Cabral. In the year 1500, he is leading a massive armada to India, following da Gama's route, but he swings far out into the Atlantic to catch the winds, and he ends up making landfall on the coast of South America. He claims this vast territory for Portugal, which eventually becomes Brazil.
And the traditional phrasing, which you still see in a lot of older materials, is that Cabral discovered Brazil.
And here is where the author of the notes really pushes back. They point out the semantic violence of that word. The text states that the word discovery hits very differently when millions of indigenous people are already living there, with their own complex societies, languages, and histories.
It's a profound shift in perspective. You cannot discover a populated continent. You encounter it, you invade it, you disrupt it. The author uses this semantic argument to ask a broader philosophical question about the entire age of discovery.
And I want to pose this directly to you, the listener. When you are assessing this era of history, how do you weigh the incredible physical courage, the sheer audacity of these navigators sailing into the terrifying unknown against the systemic generational suffering their arrivals initiated?
Yeah.
The text doesn't offer a simple equation to balance that out. It just presents the collision.
And that collision brings us to the economic engine of this empire. Because as we move into the next section of the notes, the focus shifts from exploration to extraction. The early goals of finding spices and gold quickly evolved into something much darker and more systematic, particularly in the Atlantic.
Yeah, the document lays out this transition. In the beginning, in places like India or the African coast, the Portuguese were largely trying to tap into existing trade. Forcing their way in, yes, but still trading for existing goods like pepper or ivory.
Correct.
But as they expanded, particularly to the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé and eventually massive swaths of Brazil, they realized that merely trading wasn't enough. They wanted to produce, and that meant the plantation model.
And the commodity that drove this shift was sugar. In the 15th and 16th centuries, sugar was a luxury item in Europe. It was practically considered a spice or a medicine. It commanded exorbitant prices. The Portuguese realized that the climate in Brazil and the Atlantic islands was perfect for cultivating sugarcane.
But the mechanics of a sugar plantation are brutal. It's not just farming, it's industrial agriculture.
No, absolutely.
You have to plant the cane, harvest it by hand under a blistering sun, and then immediately crush it and boil the juice in these massive, sweltering boiling houses before it ferments. It requires massive, continuous, grueling physical labor.
And this is the pivot point where the Addy personality profile turns truly grim. To fuel this massive engine of agricultural extraction, the Portuguese Empire became deeply structurally dependent on forced labor. Initially, in Brazil, they attempted to enslave the indigenous populations.
And the notes detail the horrors of this. Indigenous groups faced catastrophic dispossession of their lands. They were exposed to imported European diseases like smallpox and measles, against which they had zero immunity, leading to apocalyptic mortality rates.
It's devastating.
And those who survived were often subjected to violent labor coercion by groups of frontiersmen known as the bandeirantes, who pushed deep into the Brazilian interior specifically to capture indigenous people.
But as the indigenous populations were decimated by disease and violence, and as the demand for labor on the sugar plantations and later gold mines skyrocketed, the Portuguese crown and colonial elites turned entirely to the transatlantic slave trade.
The statistics provided in the source material are staggering. And to be clear, we are reporting directly on the historical analysis and data compiled in these notes. The author cites the Slave Voyages database, which is an academic consortium that tracks this history. And the database records over 36,000 individual slaving voyages across all empires.
But the Portuguese footprint in this trade was uniquely massive. The estimates cited in the text state that Portuguese carriers transported millions of captive African men, women, and children across the Atlantic.
Millions?
Yes. The vast majority of these human beings were forced into the holds of ships and taken to Brazil.
The notes, referencing Britannica, state that this influx made Brazil one of the largest, if not the largest, slave societies in the entire Atlantic world. The human cost is almost unfathomable to quantify.
The text is explicit in mapping out the multi-layered harms of this system. In Africa, it meant the violent disruption of societies, the trauma of capture, the horrors of the Middle Passage where mortality rates in the ship holds were horrific, and the permanent, agonizing rupture of families.
Yeah.
And in the Americas, it meant a life of brutal, coerced labor, physical violence, and social death under a rigid racial hierarchy designed entirely to maximize the extraction of wealth for a distant European elite.
And the author makes a critical observation here. The empire essentially took local violence and scaled it into a global institutionalized system. The trauma wasn't a byproduct of the empire, it was the fuel. It was the necessary mechanism that allowed the wealth to flow outward from the colonies and inward to the palaces of Lisbon.
But the notes also emphasize that a system this brutal never exists without friction. Where there's systemic oppression, there's systemic resistance.
Right.
The colonized and enslaved populations were not passive victims. They constantly fought back, rebelled, and sought autonomy.
And the text highlights one particularly powerful symbol of this resistance, Zumbi dos Palmares.
Palmares is a fascinating historical reality. It wasn't just a small camp of escapees. It was Colombo, a massive fortified settlement of escaped enslaved Africans and their descendants, located in the rugged mountainous interior of Brazil.
Wow, so an actual settlement.
Oh, at its height, it functioned almost like an independent kingdom and had a population in the tens of thousands, sustaining itself through agriculture and constantly defending itself against Portuguese military expeditions.
And Zumbi was the last great leader of Palmares in the late 17th century. The document frames him as a stark contrast to figures like Vasco da Gama. While the European navigators have legacies tangled in both discover and immense brutality, the note suggests Zumbi represents a much clearer symbol of human dignity.
Yes.
He is a figure born out of resistance to a tyrannical system, fighting purely for the freedom and survival of his people against the crushing weight of the imperial machine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this massive, violent, global movement of people created a secondary effect. It didn't just extract wealth, it threw entirely different worlds into a centrifuge. You have European administrators, enslaved African laborers, indigenous populations, and Asian merchants, all forced to interact within the architecture of the empire.
Which brings us to the cultural collider. Because the day-to-day reality of living inside this empire was a study in absolute contradictions. The source material paints a vivid picture of how different life was depending on where you stood in the hierarchy.
Let's start at the imperial center, Lisbon. For the elites, the monarchy, the nobility, the major merchants, the empire brought unprecedented luxury. The wealth of the Indies flowed into the city. They were building grand monuments, wearing imported silks, and financing art, all underwritten by the profits of pepper and sugar.
But the notes are careful to point out that this wealth did not trickle down. If you were a rural Portuguese farmer in the Alentejo region or a fisherman in the Algarve, your life in 1550 didn't look vastly different than it did in 1450. You were largely impoverished, dealing with famines, and entirely disconnected from the glittering wealth of the royal court.
And if you were a commoner, recruited or often forced to be a sailor on the Carrera da India, the India run, your life was a nightmare. These voyages to India took 6 months one way. Sailors lived in squalor, packed onto creaking wooden ships.
This is months.
Yeah, they faced typhoons, shipwrecks, and the absolute terror of scurvy, which is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that literally causes your body to fall apart. The mortality rate just from the voyage itself was staggering.
So even the people physically operating the toll booths were being chewed up by the system. Now, let's contrast Lisbon with the colonies. In a place like Brazil, the society that emerged was deeply layered and intensely unequal.
Brazilian colonial society was fundamentally shaped by the plantation economy. It was rigidly patriarchal, dominated by the wealthy sugar planters, the señores de engenho, and it was built on a strict racial hierarchy designed to justify and maintain the enslavement of Africans and the subjugation of indigenous peoples.
And deeply intertwined with all of this social control was religion. The document dedicates significant space to the role of the Roman Catholic Church.
In the Portuguese Empire, the crown and the church were inseparable. Under a papal agreement called the Padroado, the Portuguese kings were granted the authority to organize and fund church activities in their newly claimed territories.
So it was a joint venture.
Very much so. The imperial project was justified not just as a commercial venture, but as a divine mission to spread Christianity.
The notes single out Francis Xavier as the prime example of this. He was a Jesuit missionary who traveled extensively through India, Southeast Asia, and Japan.
Xavier is the embodiment of the religious duality of the empire. To the Catholic Church, he's a saint, an incredible evangelist who endured massive hardships to spread the gospel. He is credited with baptizing tens of thousands of people.
But the author of the notes looks at the systemic impact of this missionary zeal. The text states plainly, faith for some equals loss for others. The spread of Catholicism often meant the aggressive suppression of local beliefs. In places like Goa, the Portuguese eventually established the Inquisition, which violently persecuted Hindus, Muslims, and Jewish converts. Temples were destroyed, and local religious practices were outlawed. The spiritual expansion was another form of imperial control.
And yet, here's the paradox that the text explores. Despite the rigid hierarchies, the violence, and the religious suppression, you cannot force millions of people from 4 different continents to live and work in the same spaces without profound cultural bleeding.
Right.
The author describes the empire as a machine of cultural collision.
I really love that phrase, because the outputs of this machine were totally unpredictable. You see it in the physical fabric of the world today. Look at the food.
Oh, the food is the best example.
The Portuguese took chili peppers from the Americas and introduced them to India, fundamentally changing Indian cuisine. The famous Goan dish, vindaloo, comes from a Portuguese dish, carne divina dalos, meat marinated in wine and garlic.
And they introduced a technique of deep frying food to Japan, which evolved into tempura.
Wait, really? Tempura has Portuguese roots?
Yeah, entirely. It happened in language, too. Portuguese became a lingua franca in many port cities, and the cultures themselves became hybrid. In Brazil, in Angola, in Macau, entirely new identities emerged, Creole languages, syncretic religions like Candomblé in Brazil, which blended African spiritualities with Catholic saints, new forms of music and dance.
But the author adds a massive flashing warning sign to this observation. Blending does not equal fairness. Just because a new, beautiful hybrid culture emerges, it doesn't erase the violence of its creation.
Exactly.
These societies formed through intermarriage and cultural exchange, yes, but almost always under intense coercion and unequal power dynamics.
That's a crucial point.
So what does this all mean? If you zoom all the way in on a single ordinary person navigating this system, say, a mixed-race merchant in the port of Macau, or a freed, enslaved person in a Brazilian coastal town, they are living an emotional reality caught in the crossfire of this collider. They are navigating a complex new identity, speaking a hybrid language, eating hybrid food, but doing so in a system that still structurally treats them as lesser.
The psychological resilience required to just exist in that space is astonishing to think about.
It really is.
In a profound human endurance. But to pivot back to the macro scale, trying to manage this incredibly chaotic, globally dispersed network of campfires, cultures, and trade routes was a logistical high-wire act. And eventually, the physics of empire demanded a collapse, which moves us to the geopolitical chessboard and how a global network falls apart.
Because, as the saying goes, if you build a highly profitable global toll booth system, you immediately create a target on your back. Every other major power is going to want the keys to those booths.
Let's look at the players on the board. Portugal wasn't entirely alone. The text points out their oldest and most vital ally, England. They signed the Treaty of Windsor in 1386.
And the author describes this alliance as having proper ride-or-die energy, which is honestly the most accurate, non-academic description of a treaty I've ever read.
It is remarkably accurate. The alliance with England, which, by the way, is technically still active today, provided Portugal with critical naval and military support against its larger continental rivals, particularly Spain.
Wow, still active.
Yeah. They also formed temporary strategic alliances with local rulers in Africa and India, trading European firearms for access to ports, or pitting local rivals against each other.
But those local alliances were incredibly fragile. If a local ruler realized the Portuguese were becoming too powerful, or if a better offer came along, those treaties dissolved into war. And Portugal had massive existential rivals from the very beginning.
Right. In the 16th century, their primary adversaries in the Indian Ocean were the Islamic empires, most notably the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, allied with the Mamluks of Egypt and local Indian sultanates, recognized the existential threat the Portuguese posed to their control of the spice routes to the Mediterranean.
They weren't just going to let them take over.
No, not at all. This led to massive naval clashes, highlighted in the notes by the Battle of Diu in 1509.
The Battle of Diu is a huge turning point. It's essentially the Portuguese caravels and heavily armed carracks going up against a massive fleet of traditional galleys. The Portuguese naval artillery proved absolutely devastating. Winning that battle temporarily secured their dominance over the Indian Ocean.
But the true threat didn't actually come from the East. It came from their fellow Europeans. As the 16th century turned into the 17th, new hungry powers emerged. The English, the French, and most lethally for Portugal, the Dutch Republic.
And this is where Portugal suffers a catastrophic geopolitical stumble, one that the notes argue was the beginning of the end. And strangely, it didn't happen on the ocean. It happened in a royal lineage dispute, the Iberian Union.
Yes. In 1580, Portugal suffered a dynastic crisis. Their young King Sebastian died in a disastrous crusade in Morocco, leaving no direct heir. Through a complex web of royal marriages and military pressure, King Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese throne.
Oh, man.
So for 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, Portugal and Spain were ruled by the exact same monarch.
Now, this sounds like it should make them stronger, right? A massive mega empire. But the notes explain why it was actually a disaster for Portugal's network.
It was a disaster because by becoming unified with Spain, Portugal instantly inherited all of Spain's enemies. And Spain's biggest enemy at the time was the newly independent, incredibly aggressive Dutch Republic. Prior to this, the Dutch were actually the middlemen who distributed Portuguese spices in northern Europe. Now, because of Spain, they were locked out.
So the Dutch decide, well, if we can't buy from the toll booths, we'll just go take the toll booths.
Exactly. This raises an important question. How did an empire that survived the Ottomans and navigated the deep ocean finally crack? The text answers it simply. They were outscaled and outorganized. Portugal won the race to start globalization, but they lacked the structural capacity to sustain it against modernizing rivals.
You know what this entire arc reminds me of?
What's that?
The business mechanics are identical to a modern tech startup. Portugal is the classic disruptive startup. They are first to market with a brilliant, highly aggressive strategy, the Cartaz network. They move fast, they break things, literally bombarding cities, and they set up nodes everywhere.
That's a highly leveraged, high-risk operation.
Yes, but they completely overextend themselves. They have this massive global footprint, but their management team in Lisbon is tiny. They don't have the capital or the personnel to upgrade their infrastructure.
Right.
And then the massive, well-funded tech conglomerates, in this case, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, just swoop in. The Dutch didn't invent the spice trade, they just optimized it.
They absolutely did.
They brought better financing, like the first stock market, better corporate structure, and heavily armed, standardized ships. They systematically copied Portugal's model, attacked their isolated campfires, and just took their market share.
That analogy holds up remarkably well under historical scrutiny. The Dutch East India Company was essentially a ruthless multinational corporation with its own army. The sheer absurdity of Portugal's overextension finally caught up to them. The text captures this beautifully, describing it as trying to run the whole world with a tiny team.
Yeah.
The attrition was inevitable. The Dutch took Malacca, they took forts in West Africa, they even temporarily occupied parts of Brazil. Portugal fought back and they managed to hold on to significant territories like Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique. But the monopoly was broken.
And the final fatal blow to the true power of the empire came much later, in the 19th century. In 1822, Brazil declared its independence under Dom Pedro I. Brazil had become the absolute economic heart of the empire, generating the vast majority of its wealth through sugar and gold.
Right. Losing Brazil was like a corporation losing 80% of its revenue overnight. After that, Portugal retained colonies in Africa and Asia until the mid-20th century, fighting brutal, drawn-out colonial wars to keep them, but the era of global dominance was permanently over.
Which brings us to the psychological core of the entire document, Section 7, the Addy reflection. How do we synthesize hundreds of years of incredible maritime innovation, brutal systemic extraction, deep cultural fusion, and global warfare into a single personality framework?
The author asks us to take a step back and look at the whole picture. Map this entire bloody, brilliant, devastating history onto that Addy personality profile when it is given unchecked, large-scale power.
And the text acknowledges the light red.
It does. At its most flattering, the history of the empire reflects Addy's best, most human traits. It shows a profound curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon. It shows incredible mobility, boldness, a deep love of experience, and a restless energy to connect distant, disparate worlds. That is the beautiful side of the human desire to explore.
But then, the notes force us to look at the dark shift. The text argues that when you take that exact same adventurous, spontaneous energy and you fuse it with state power, a demand for endless profit, and overwhelming military force, the traits warp, they mutate.
Yes. Adventure, when backed by cannons, becomes intrusion. The explorer's desire for freedom to roam becomes the domination and enslavement of the people they encounter. And the desire for connection, the instinct to link the globe, becomes a cynical mechanism for total control and wealth extraction.
This is the core beating heart of the entire document. History isn't just a movie with clean-cut heroes in shining armor and villains in dark robes. History is an ongoing, visceral demonstration of what happens when base human ambition collides with unchecked power and golden opportunity.
The Portuguese Empire, in this framework, is Addy's wild spark, but completely devoid of her conscience. It is the appetite for the entire world, but lacking the empathy to recognize the humanity of the people in it.
The thrill of discovery turns into the cold machinery of extraction. It's an emotionally heavy realization. Reading through this final section of the notes, it feels like. It feels like someone offering you a warm handshake, but you know they have a drawn sword hidden behind their back.
Wow. Yeah.
It's the story of a nation saying yes to too many adventures, pushing too far into the unknown until they are utterly exhausted, outmatched, and they have broken countless things and millions of people along the way.
The author distills it into one perfect sentence. A personality trait that feels beautiful at a human scale can become profoundly destructive at a global scale. When curiosity is scaled up globally without the absolute restraint of empathy, human beings become collateral damage.
So I want to ask you, the listener, right now, I want you to think about your own best qualities. Think about your drive, your insatiable curiosity, your ambition to succeed. What happens when your very best qualities are stripped of empathy and handed unlimited resources? It's a terrifying but absolutely necessary question to ask ourselves when we look in the mirror.
Because the legacy of this history isn't dead. It is still actively shaping the world we live in. We can look at the tangible legacies. We can see the massive spread of the Lusophone world, the fact that Portuguese is the dominant language across Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, and East Timor.
We can look at geopolitical organizations like the CPLP, the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, which fosters cooperation across these independent nations today. We can celebrate UNESCO's World Portuguese Language Day, honoring a language that connects millions of people across continents. We can revel in the deep, beautiful cultural fusions in global music, art, and cuisine that were born from this era.
But the notes mandate that we also recognize the enduring shadow. The legacy is also the deeply embedded racial hierarchies that still plague the Americas. It is the distorted, extractive economies of the global South. It is the generational, unhealed damage of the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese Empire was the ultimate pioneering engine of early globalization, but we cannot separate the globalization from the violent extraction that fueled it.
And that brings us to the end of the notes, but it leaves us with a critical lens for the future.
Exactly. I will leave you with a final vital thought to mull over, one that builds directly on this psychological framework. We've just spent the last hour exploring how pure human curiosity and the desire for connection, when scaled globally without a foundational layer of empathy, created a centuries-long empire of extraction and trauma. As you look at the world right now today, where we are rapidly scaling our own new massive technological ambitions, think about the explosive growth of artificial intelligence, the mass collection of human data, the rush to commercialize and colonize space. We have to ask ourselves, are we making the exact same mistake? Are we launching new, glittering campfires across the digital and literal universe, driven purely by technical curiosity and corporate profit, while completely leaving empathy and human consequence out of the driver's seat?
Are we just building the next global network of toll booths and ignoring who gets crushed under the wheels? It's a question that demands our absolute attention. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the sanitized textbook narratives, and keep questioning the systems that shape the world around you. Because as we've seen today, that X-ray machine of history is never quite as clean as we want it to be.